Welcome viewers. It is my pleasure to ask questions to GST Guru Batra sir. So we'll be discussing the questions related to the topic of valuation under the GST law. So sir, one of the first question is that whether the GST valuation provisions will apply to export of goods if the taxpayer selects an option of making the supply with payment and then claiming refund subsidy.
Yes, in a way you are saying that I want to export the goods by charging tax and claiming the refund of that amount and discharging my liability after deducting the tax credit which is available. If you look at it in critical manner, it is not going to make much financial difference. For example, the value is 100 and I am charging 18 rupees as a tax, assuming, and the credit is 12 rupees. So I'll pay 6 to the government and I claim of rupees 18 as a refund from the department. Now I say the value I take as 101. Once I take 110 rupees as the value, I'll pay to the government 1980 minus 12, 7 rupees 80 paise. I'll claim a credit of 1980. So in a way, I am paying more and getting more. So there's no disincentive to show a figure which is more. And then it has got serious implication with regard to FEMA. If my goods are worth 100 and I am charging 110 rupees and 120, then there can be an allegation that you are engaged into paying out to foreign exchange, can be misused and all that. So I will say because it will not result into any financial gain to you, so it is advisable to go by the transactional value only.
Now, one of the key point, as you also discussed in your talk, is that if there is a relationship the supplier and the recipient are related parties, then the transaction value has to be overlooked and one has to necessarily go to the valuation rules, even if the transaction has been at arm's length, and determine the open market value. If the same is at arm's length, then there will be no addition. Otherwise, the open market value or any other criteria like the value of like kind of goods or cost basis has to be selected. Now, the concept of related party is given in explanation to section 15.
Section 15.
Now the definition of related person talks about control. It says if one person is able to control the other, then they are deemed to be related parties. So how do you look at this word control? Because there is no really objective test that they have given in that explanation. So whether you look at the ownership criteria, you look at the board composition, if let us say the recipient is a body corporate, it's a partnership firm.
I will certainly say because this kind of provisions were already there in company law, in income tax also, interrelated parties and all that where the parameters for shareholding as well as the management both were being considered. Now, once I can influence that party, it may be due to shareholding, it may be due to my representation in the management. But looking from GST perspective, I really fail to understand how it is going to be affected if the credit is available to the other party. In most of the cases, because these are B2B transactions, it will have no implication except cash flow or some investment. As I was giving an example in my deliberation also, suppose you are a manufacturer of ready garment in Ludhiana and you had a 3 showroom in Delhi, Gurgaon and Noida. I took the same example and 1 crore is the average inventory which I carry in each of the showroom. So the total inventory which I carry is 3 crore. Let us say my cost of production is 100 rupees. If I charge 110 and apply the rate of tax, let us say 18%, 19 rupees 80 paisa. So my investment in the inventory is 54 lakh. But if I charge 90 rupees, then my investment goes down to less than 20%, whatever is the rate difference. So in any case, that is the only advantage I am carrying out. Because once I will pay the less tax, he will also get the less tax credit. Ultimately, the goods are being sold at the market price to the customer on which I am liable to pay the tax. Whatever amount I am collecting, I have to distribute either to you or to the government. So when I have claim less credit and pay less to the government, if I claim more credit, I pay less to the government. If I claim less credit, pay more to the government. In any case. But yes, financial implications are really important. If 3 crore rupees is the inventory which I am carrying, and let us say there is a price difference at 20%, so my investment goes down from 54 lakh to 10% less of than 10 lakh, that is around 44 lakh. That is the only advantage, nothing else. Otherwise, the credit is available to me, there is no point. So the government has taken a calculated risk and it has got an inherent disadvantage also. If I want to understand what is the profitability of each of my showrooms, Delhi, Bombay, and Delhi, Gurgaon, and Noida, then as a cost center, I must bill them at 110% because it is not only manufacturing cost, administrative cost also. And rather, I will say at the market price at which I am supplying it to other party to know the real profitability. So the gains are less, the losses are more. Maybe in terms of financial, if it is a very huge inventory, then one may be tempted to manipulate that. And that is the reason the government realizing there is no financial implication except for the less investment and some cash flow issues. So they have provided this into the second provision to mitigate.
Now, coming to that second proviso, now one of the clear catch in that proviso is that the full input tax credit should be available to the recipient in order to apply that proviso. Now, let us take a case where a manufacturing unit is doing a stock transfer of 100 units of their product A, and it is applying a notional value. Now, out of those 100 units, the branch gives one unit as a sample, which triggers my 17(5) clause H, which says that ITC shall not be available if I am giving free samples. Now, in such scenario, will my entire invoice containing those 100 units will not be able to enjoy the second proviso benefit, or only with respect to the one unit which has been given as a
If you
sample?
go by the strict legal interpretation, the whole lot will not get the benefit, will not get the benefit of second provision 28. But the fact remains, if that being so, as I told you, the advantage is only temporary cash flow or the investment. Barring that, if I want to know the real profitability, which everybody would like to know, nobody will indulge into that. But looking forward, there can be those kind of situations which you're talking about. I can say to the department, ultimately, what is the loss to the revenue? Of course, up to the tribunal stage, which are statutory court, which has to go by the strict interpretation of the law which has been laid down. And when we go to the higher courts like High Court and Supreme Court, which are constitutional court, and they can apply even principle natural justice, they can question the revenue. What is the loss? Look broadly, and the loss is only with regard to one item in case he has claimed it. In any case, there is no loss as such. The only thing is, if I was valuing it for 100 rupees and now I valued it for 90 rupees, so my dissonance would have been 10 rupees or it is now 9 rupees. So that is the only loss which has caused to you. So that amount plus interest and penalty you can cover. We have seen in the case of tax credit also in the past, once these kind of cases were there and I have wrongly availed but not utilized and there was a credit balance. The Supreme Court also said, what is the financial loss to you? When there is no financial loss, why are you bothering him unnecessarily? So those kind of litigation will go and you will get relief in the higher courts like High Court and Supreme Court. But till tribunal, it will be a subject matter of litigation and nobody would like to buy the litigation. So better course is when the credit is available, we go by the concept of open market.
Now, sir, another question is that the way consideration has been defined. Now, Section 15(1) says that if price is not the sole consideration, I have to compulsorily go to the evaluation route. Now, consideration not only includes something in kind, but it also includes some act of forbearance, act of tolerance. Now, all these aspects as an auditor, when he sits and wants to file 9C and certify it, how does he really trace all those elements?
I kindly appreciate 95% B2C transactions have only cash element. When we talk about B2B element, I personally feel it is not going to make much difference because the government is not losing anything. If they're getting less amount of tax, they are giving less amount of credit. So there is no loss to the revenue as such. So looking to the broader perspective, according to my understanding, it is not going to make much difference.
Another related issue is that these days now this concept of giving bonus points when you enroll on any website or any app, they give you some bonus points as credit, and you can redeem those points against the consideration. So technically, I have not paid anything to get those points. Those points are coming in my wallet. I am redeeming those points, and let us say against a fair value of 500 rupees, they are giving me discount of 100 rupees on account of those bonus points redemption, and only 400 rupees is charged from me. Now, the valuation rule when it comes to all those kinds of vouchers, tokens, says that the fair value of the goods which you can get against those tokens has to be considered as the value of supply. Even in the market, we are seeing that all the retail companies, when we go to the mall, when we redeem these kind of vouchers, they are charging GST on the gross value and not the net amount which is actually payable by the customer. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, it is too complicated a matter, but does not have much of any implication. I'll explain it to you how. Once I'm earning the reward is nothing but a marketing strategy. I'm giving you a discount which may or may not be encashed. For example, if I offer a discount of 10%, I'm having an inventory of 1 lakh. I had a cost of 10%. If I give you a offer of discount of 20% and I know only 50% point will be redeemed, again my cost is 10,000, but it looks like very attractive that I am getting a discount of 20%. So I am only restricting myself to your the kind of example you have given, because otherwise it can be number of vouchers,
Yes,
there are number of permutation combination in the commercial world with regard to discount. So keeping this, is it not a discount which I undertake to pay you when you come next time for making a sale? Then where is the question of any valuation dispute? Today, I am selling you the product at the market, right? If I am giving you a pen for 100 rupees and giving you a bonus point of 10 which comes to your pocket, which you can use it for buying my other product. So as of now, as on today, I am paying tax on the open market value. No question to that. Now, once I come, I give you a discount. If you are my regular customer, I say you come next time, I'll redeem you this point, again the purchase of 500 rupees. So at that point of time, I am offering him a discount because he has already agreed to the contractual obligation, he has already made a purchase. So at that point of time, you are selling him a goods worth rupees 500 and is getting a discount of rupees 50. What is wrong in that?
So then, in that
450
case,
is the value.
what are those scenarios then possibly where Rule 32 comes into play when it talks about vouchers, points, and tokens?
Okay, as I told you, these are very, this is a very broad subject. Let us say, you must have seen in your practical experience also, when you buy a suit length of 10,000, you have been given a stay in a hill station of Missouri with 2 night, 1 day, or 2 night, 3 days, which is costing you 8,000. Immediately the question comes, how can a purchase of 10,000 can attract a discount of 8,000 rupees? Something wrong. There's nothing wrong. There are specialized companies which hedge you on this transaction. They say, I will sell you this discount coupon at 25% of the value. 2,000 rupees का discount coupon. So when he's selling it at 2,000, I'm buying 100 coupon from him. I'm paying in 2 lakh, which is the independent supply. So they will charge me on that. Once that coupon has been discounted in the Missouri hotel, that is again independent supply. Once he will say, he will get the money from the person who is selling me the voucher. He will again charge the tax. So these are the permutation combinations. So with this kind of 32 talk about in these kind of vouchers, only the last leg of supply, wherein that hotel wala is redeeming my voucher. So once he is redeeming against the room supply, so that room supply is less than 7,500, the same kind of tax it will attract, which I am liable to pay when I am giving that room to another gentleman. So this Rule 32 is only on the last leg of that.
Correct. Now, sir, the last question before we end this discussion is regard to this pure agent concept, which all our professional brothers are struggling with. As you rightly said in your talk, that out of the 8 conditions, 5 conditions have been dropped. So, is it now necessary that the invoice of the third party, which I have incurred an expenditure on behalf of my recipient, has to be in the name of the recipient in order to claim the benefit of pure agent, or even if that invoice is in the name of supplier, but it is on account of the contractual understanding with the recipient that he is incurring it on his behalf, will that suffice?
In GST regime, I don't subscribe to your view. Okay, first of all, I am making payment where the recipient is supposed to make the payment. If I was supposed to incur that expenditure and that expenditure is being debited in my account, not debited to the customer account, then certainly once it is my expense, I am bearing the incidence of tax, then certainly it is subject to tax, because then I'll claim the credit of. Look from credit point of view, if let us say you are spending something on account of that supply which is subject to GST, so I would certainly like to buy in the name of my client, because so that he can avail the credit. I am making the payment, that is not important. What is really important is who is the recipient. Recipient is the one who is liable to make the payment. Who actually makes the payment has nothing to do with it. So in any case, looking from that credit point of view also, I should have the name of the recipient on the invoice. And even looking from another perspective also, because it it should be an expense which has to be borne by the recipient. It has to be in the name of the recipient. So my suggestion will be, in all the cases, we must take an invoice in the name of the recipient.
The purpose was that because the rule clearly does not say this, which was in the earlier
The
regime.
rule says, in case any amount has to be incurred by the supplier, even if it is being paid by the recipient, it has to be included in the value of taxable supply.
So that is fulfilled here.
So once the amount has to be paid by the recipient, then only it can be a pure agent. If it was my responsibility to pay, then certainly I can never be a pure agent. If the amount has to be paid by the supplier, then it has to be added. So once I am paying the tax, I am entitled for the credit, there is no problem. So pure agent will only come when the expenditure of the supply is on behalf of the recipient. When the recipient is supposed to incur some expenditure.
So
I gave
you
an
are saying
example
not
of
only-
TDS and all that.
So not only contract between third party, not a contract should be there between third party and the recipient, but even invoicing has to be done in the name of recipient.
Yes.
In order to claim this.
In order to optimize the financial gain also and to keep the transaction cost at the minimum level, even if let us assume you have taken that invoice in your name, you cannot debit to your expense because the corresponding income is not there. If you go to the accounting standard, there is a matching concept. So you have to debit it to the party concerned. You debit it, recover it, and the invoice is not in his name. Then in terms of 16.2, he is not entitled for the credit. So it will be a financially not a prudent decision to do so.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Welcome, viewers. It is my pleasure to discuss certain FAQs with Bimal Jain sir, the GST guru. So let us begin with one elementary question that location of supplier of goods is not defined. Now let us take one case where let us say I am based in Delhi. I have imported goods at a port in Mumbai, and from there itself I have sold it to a customer located in Maharashtra. So where is the location of supplier?
When you look at this provision during my deliberation on place of supply, I explained that location of importer would be the location of supplier of goods. So it need not be Maharashtra, it will continue to be Delhi, as instant example you have taken up. So location of supplier of goods would be Delhi. And then this delivery terminating within the state of Maharashtra, it would be interstate supply, IGST should have been charged.
Now, if we just add one layer of complexity to this illustration, let us say that in Maharashtra at the port, I have rented some premises, warehouse for a short duration where I am going to store these goods and then supply it from such warehouse. However, in the bill of entry that I file, I always declare Delhi as my location. So, whether your answer will differ in the facts.
In this case, my answer may differ depending on the situation, how long I'm storing the goods in that rented premises. So warehouse, showroom, the place where I'm storing my goods, that can turn out to be my location of supplier of goods, because then from that destination, I'm supplying goods. So in that case, registration may be required in the state of Maharashtra to undertake this transaction.
Now, location of supplier of services is well defined because we have a clear definition in the law under section 2, subsection 15. So, let us take one case to just bring home this point. That let us say the concerned supplier is in the business of recruiting and supplying trained staff at various locations of the clients. So, let us take the case of an IT company. So, IT company gives an order to a supplier who is based out of Delhi to recruit certain staff for such company. The recruiting company carries out the work of analyzing the CVs of prospective clients. The employees of the recruiting company are based at the client site. The recruiting company invoices to the client on the basis of the salary plus their fixed charges. The recruiting company, however, also has a branch office in that particular state where the client is located. Now, this is a case where you are supplying services from two locations. One is the branch who is also playing a certain role in the supply, and the head office who is doing the main recruitment work. So, in this case where we have two locations from where the supply is happening, how do we identify the location which is more directly concerned with this supply? So, do you look at the contract? Do you look at the actual rendering of services? What do you look at and what importance do you give to the contract vis-a-vis actual rendering of services?
Now, this is quite a position where we need to really understand that privity of contract, that is going to play a very important role. If privity of contract of client is with the company in a particular state, let's say Delhi. So privity of contract, let's say my client is located in Delhi and my recruiting main office is located in Delhi. So privity of contract is being signed off. Now, for undertaking certain services, I have asked my branch to undertake certain services, allied services pertaining to my main services. But privity of contract is not there with my branch and with my client. So in this case, for raising my invoice, main service invoice will happen from Delhi to Delhi only. But this branch will in turn raise invoice for the services undertaken on my behalf as if it is inter-branch transfer of services from one branch to another branch, and they will charge GST. It's a kind of supply of services between distinct persons, of which I will avail credit. My branch is not supposed to raise invoice directly to my client because privity of contract is not falling within two entities. So we have to really understand, in this case, my branch is undertaking services on my behalf. They will raise invoice on me and charge GST on the parameter of location of supply and place of supply. But as I said, these transaction remodeling required in GST regime, which was not there in pre-GST era.
Correct, absolutely. So I think more importance should be given to the way contract is drafted, worded, and which location takes the responsibility of making the supply.
Rightly said.
That would become the location.
Rightly said. Rightly said.
Now, sir, one more issue is that location of recipient of services is defined. Now, that definition, if you understand, says that if the services are received at a location which is registered, then that location. If it is received at a fixed establishment which is not registered, then the fixed establishment. Now, in that case, let us say we have got a contract of rendering the services in Karnataka. The company supplier is situated in Delhi. But the contract is not issued by the Karnataka office of the recipient, but by the Delhi office of the recipient. Now, in such scenario, can I say that my place of supply will be Delhi only because the recipient of services is registered in Delhi and it is from Delhi that I am getting the contract, even though actually services are being rendered in Karnataka? Or I have to necessarily invoice only at the Karnataka location by charging IGST?
These are the questions I have also discussed while giving my deliberation on place of supply. Now, I said privity of contract is very, very important. When my daily client has placed an order to me for giving services to my Karnataka office, so I'm not having any privity of contract with the client Karnataka office. Now, in this case, I would be raising my invoice to daily client as an intra-state. Of course, the daily client will take credit, but they cannot take this credit because they have not received and consumed these services for their daily unit. It is for the Karnataka office. So at most they have to take ISD registration, Input Service Distributor registration, and distribute this credit to Karnataka where it is pertaining to, related to, relevant to. This may be one mode. Another mode could be, now just by change of transaction, I charge IGST because it's pertaining to Karnataka office, it will not work. Maybe we have to change the transaction, we will change the PO. Instead of Delhi, we will ask Karnataka office to place an order to my Delhi supplier.
So
then IGST should have been charged. So a transaction is divided into two modes, but ultimately we have to keep it to our mind that GST being a destination-based consumption tax, it must accrue to a state where ultimately goods and services are being consumed. Keeping in that mind, ISD route is also suggested in a way because this credit which is being charged by supplier in Delhi is not being kept by the recipient, rather distributed to the relevant Karnataka branch. Possible way. Another way, change the model. Don't do like that. Don't take ISD registration. Don't get into hassle of it. But change the placing of order. Instead of Delhi, let Karnataka branch place direct order to the supplier and IGST levy.
So essentially what you are saying is that you respect the substance of the transaction.
Yes, correct.
If the services are actually being rendered in Karnataka, there is no point in involving Delhi office and complicating this transaction.
Perfect.
Better to straight away invoice
Yes,
to Karnataka
yes,
and
yes.
let the credit be claimed by Karnataka.
Yes,
location.
yes. And I can also go further in case of sometime AMC services. Like what happened, you take AMC services and place an order, consolidated order at one location, but which is meaning for services in 31 states. So what happened? Can you avail 100% credit at one location where from orders being placed? Answer is big no. Big no. So either you should get ISD registration done, or to avoid the complication, you can have a system of this PO is being divided with respective state-wise where you exactly want to procure the services.
Correct. Now, sir, coming to SEZ, now the law provides that any supply to SEZ shall be deemed as interstate supply. Now, do you see any difference between whether that supply is for authorized operations or not for authorized operations? What difference does it make when it comes to determination of place of supply from the perspective of supplier? That whether every service to SEZ, whether for authorized operations or not, shall always be an interstate supply, or will there be a difference?
Now, to answer your query, I would like to recall a recent advance ruling which came for accommodation services provided to SEZ unit. Now, in that advance ruling, the contrary feature was it is being stated it is not zero rated, first of all, and secondly, it would be intrastate. These were the 2 points came in that advance ruling. Now, when we look at section 7, which talks about interstate supply, it only says supply of goods or services to or by SEZ unit or developer. There is no reference of authorized operation. So, first of all, this transaction would be interstate supply. To enjoy the benefit of zero rated in terms of section 16 of IGST Act, then you may contemplate whether it is for authorized operation or for non-authorized operation. To my mind, to avoid dispute, because ultimately whatever services procured by SEZ unit need to be demonstrated, it is meant for authorized operation. So if it is meant for authorized operation, then it is zero rated and will always be interstate supply. It will not be intrastate supply. But if you pose this query where it is written authorized operation, nowhere written, but if you go to SEZ Act, it draws reference that these services are goods meant for authorized operation. So indirectly, we have to satisfy those conditions. This is my personal view.
And just an additional question to that, that merely a PO from an SEZ unit will be sufficient to prove that these services have gone into SEZ, because these are intangible.
No. Straightforward, no. PO will not suffice the purpose.
So what else do you think that auditor, GST auditor should verify in order to allow this claim of supply to an SEZ as an interstate supply?
So we see letter of approval which is being issued by Development Commissioner for procuring specified services. So first we have to identify whether the status services is falling in that particular letter of approval which is issued by Development Commissioner. Secondly, we have to make sure that we get certification done by SEZ unit stating that these services are being procured exclusively for their authorized operation. Being intangible, you cannot bifurcate whether it is being used for authorized or non-authorized. But these are the precautions which we can take and ensure it is meant for authorized operation. Otherwise, for intangible services, you need to rely on the declaration or disclosures given by your client. But being supply, you must ensure this is being stated in a letter of approval issued by Development Commissioner. You must identify these services are being categorized therein. Second, you take certificate from your SEZ unit and developer that he has used these services for his authorized operation. That would be 2 broad parameters I would be looking into to enjoy the benefit of zero rated.
Sure. Now coming to place of supply when it comes to goods where section 10 is applicable, there is a provision with regard to bill to and ship to transaction. Now, can that provision be applied to distinct persons? I will give an example. Let us have 2 registrations. One is in Kerala, another is in Gujarat. Now, I ask the supplier in Kerala to invoice it at my Gujarat GSTN, but to give the delivery of those goods to my Kerala branch. Is it possible, or whether bill to ship to necessarily requires 3 legally independent parties, or whether the independence which is discussed under section 10 is with regard to the concept of distinct persons? Can that be applied?
It can be applied for distinct person. That need not be legally distinct legally different company. So if we are distinct person, means in GST we have 3 different registration altogether. So now if A is asking a supplier, B is in a different state, you say B is asking A supplier to deliver my another distinct unit in same state.
Correct.
In Kerala example,
Kerala.
which
But-
you
Yes.
which you took. So what happened? The first case I would be invoicing as interstate IGST because 10(1)(b, the place of business of intermediary come into the picture. Then this intermediary is going to raise the invoice to another distinct person because in GST they are called distinct person. In what context? They are called distinct person because they are having separate registration in 2 different states. So same transaction as I am doing with the unrelated party will come into the related party. Only valuation will chip in for different aspect for the valuation set.
So necessarily the word third party used in 10(1)(b) can also include distinct
Of
persons.
course, for
third
me-
party does not necessarily mean legally separate.
Independent party or unrelated party, to my mind.
Now, one more provision with regard to place of supply when it comes to goods is where the movement is not there. The law says that in such scenario where the delivery is given to the recipient shall be the place of supply. Now, let me give you one practical example which happens is with respect to molds and dies. Now, my customer tells me to design and develop a mold. He is going to pay separately for that mold, but I am not required to give that mold to my customer. I am going to use it in manufacturing components out of it, and then components will be sold separately to my customer. Now, when I do the invoicing of the mold, what would be the place of supply? Because molds will not be moving to my customer's location.
Now, these are the practical examples still persisting today. And if we look at GST requires seamless flow of credit. Now, in this transaction, had this mold and dies moved to the principal and principal has again given a delivery challan, then this transaction would be seamless flow of credit, IGST charge, and this would have been seamless
Job
flow of credit. Only because this is not moving out from my job worker premises, you are assuming that this is intrastate transaction, then CGST and SGST going to be cascading in the hands of principal. That's what your assumption all about. To my mind, that makes no difference to me. If we look at this particular, mold and die, which is ultimately meant for my principal. Instead of, taking this transaction with actual physical movement, I'm just deeming this transaction. So deeming fiction is just in the books of accounts when job worker is receiving goods on behalf of principal and credit is flowing to the principal. Why can't this transaction be applied therein?
So,
To my
your
mind-
view is
to
it
my
will be
mind-
interstate supply.
Of course, because when deeming receipt of goods, credit is available to the principal. You take an example. For the viewers, I'm making it more simple so that you can get this idea. I'm a principal in Delhi. I'm asking my supplier in Calcutta to deliver the goods to my job worker. My job worker, let's say, is stationed at Ahmedabad in Gujarat. So what happened? These goods are going Calcutta to Ahmedabad directly. It's not coming back to me. When my job worker received the goods, it is a deeming receipt by principal for availing credit. Why these provisions? There also they could have applied this provision since not being received by principal. In mold and dies also same thing happening. Let's assume this mold and dies is not made by job worker, made by third party, and then left it to my job worker. Then what happened? Then this is deemed receipt in the hands of principal. To my mind, these are some of the if and buts query just as on date. But if you look at the theme is mainly these mold and dies meant for usage only for my principal, and credit should have been given to the principal. But it can't be ruled out that there will not be any divergent views in this.
Another question is with regard to this place of supply when it comes to immovable property related services. Now, as you are aware, in the draft law, we didn't had the word directly in relation to immovable property. It was only in relation to immovable property. And then in the act, finally, the word came directly in relation to immovable property. Now, in case of a real estate broker, I am, let us say, based in Delhi. Now, I make a deal between a seller and a buyer, but the property is located in, let us say, Maharashtra. So, but the seller is in Delhi. The person who owns that property is registered in Delhi. So, when I want to invoice for my brokerage commission, what would be the place of supply?
I do understand that your queries are quite prominent and practical. I'm not saying that they are not practical, of course practical. But when I say these real estate services, can I say these real estate services has got no relation with immovable property? Can I say that directly or indirectly it is pertaining to in relation to immovable property only? Now, if it is not in relation to immovable property, I can create two situations here. If it is not in relation to, then it is falling under default rule. Then CGST and SGST available chargeable, for which he will get the credit. But since property located in Gujarat or Maharashtra, whatever you say, IGST to be levied, IGST credit would be available to this recipient GST number. Only SGST component of IGST will accrue to the state where it is ultimately going to be consumed. So your point was whether this is possible or not possible. In both situations, it looks like credit is coming to the recipient account.
Now, provided recipient is registered in Maharashtra. If he is not registered,
let's say
it was my investment.
If not registered, then you are creating
a problem.
Then that is a problem.
Practically,
then that is a problem. But again, I will say it will be in relation to the property, but going with a strict,
So the whole idea of this question was to understand the word directly. Right? What do you consider directly and what do you consider indirectly?
I got your point, but this particular question is not so free to ask. But there are divergent views existing as on date. But to my mind, law need to be corrected that these like real estate broking services are pertaining to, in relation to, and in relation has got wider meaning altogether. But by using it directly, you are creating some kind of departure. So maybe you're creating some departure and then you want to avoid this real estate broking services not falling into that rules pertaining to immovable property. But to my mind, these are the dispute persisting as on date. No straightforward answer to this, but subject to divergent views.
Because one of the practical difficulty that these particular real estate brokers are facing is more when NRIs are investing in India.
I'm getting your point.
And if my place of supply is India, I cannot take the benefit of zero rating.
I agree. Completely.
So the GST becomes a huge cost.
Completely agreeable to you. No denial to it.
So,
but only point in such cases, wherever you got more litigation, let's take the initiative of going and filing a writ and decide question of law.
Now coming to section 13, which deals with place of supply of services where one of them, supplier or recipient, is outside India. Now in case of intermediary services, the law says that the place of supply shall be the location of that intermediary. Now the way intermediary has been defined, let us take one case where I am an agent, where I promote the goods of a foreign company. The entire transaction happens between the foreign company and the Indian buyer. I only arrange a deal. Then whether I will be an intermediary and hence whether place of supply shall be my office.
I know you must have seen my deliberation on place of supply, but again, since we are taking up question, straightforward question, and here I would like to draw the reference of government policies, how contrary it is. Look at the example which you took, and I'm explaining that example by way of taking a real example. Let's say I'm intermediary, I'm located in Delhi. Foreign supplier located in Korea asking me to create customer base in India. So what happened? Foreign supplier is saying, Mr. Jain, registered in Delhi, identified customer base. I will supply the goods to the customer directly. One transaction is being done. I will pay you some percentage as commission or by whatever name call. So what happened? I have find out the customer base. I have identified the customer for my foreign supplier. Foreign supplier has supplied the goods directly to customer in India. And once this transaction executed, I'm raising my invoice as a percentage of turnover or by any other mode as decided mutually between intermediary and the foreign supplier. I'm raising my invoice for intermediary, as I said under section 13. Place of supply will be location of supplier, meaning thereby this transaction is not an export of service. So what happened? Location of supplier Delhi and place of supply, again location of supplier, GST leviable. So it is not export, even though this intermediary is getting paid in convertible foreign exchange. So he's drawing convertible foreign exchange, getting convertible foreign exchange for country India, but still it is not export of services. GST leviable. So what happens? 18% becomes disadvantage to this intermediary. What happens if he goes to Bangladesh, Nepal and undertakes such activity? Then what happens? These particular category becomes incompetitive from intermediary perspective. Now let's reverse this example and see contrary version of Indian government policy. Let's say I'm into Korea now. I am intermediary, I'm in Korea now. And I'm being approached by Indian supplier. An Indian supplier wanted me to identify customer base in Korea. I identify customer base in Korea, and then this Indian supplier supplying goods to customer in Korea. I'm raising invoice being an intermediary from Korea to India. Question comes whether reverse charge applicable in the hands of Indian supplier. This is the question I'm posting to all of you. You may think of for 5 second or 10 second. Reverse charge not applicable. Why not applicable? Location of supplier Korea and place of supply again Korea. Both are outside India. No reverse charge applicable. And in this case, convertible foreign exchange going out of the country. See the irony where I'm getting convertible foreign exchange, GST leviable, cost, incompetitive, and where GST going out of the country, no GST leviable. So irony, and this provision of intermediary got changed in erstwhile POP rules 2012 from 1st October 2014. Same copy-paste provision in GST place of supply. We are raising voice and concern to the government authority representing at several points of time that these problems need to be corrected, and we have to really provide seamless flow of credit, which is the mantra of GST being good and simple tax. That is my answer to you.
Now, sir, the last question before we end this, which is very critical, that recently, 2 days back, a ruling came by the High Court where one party, there was a vehicle which was detained because of some technical default in the e-way bill. So the officer asked him to pay IGST, but by mistake he deposited SGST. The officer said that you take refund of SGST, but you will have to again pay IGST if you want to release the vehicle. The assessee approached the court through bridge jurisdiction saying that why you are asking me again to pay IGST, you adjust my SGST that I have already paid against my IGST. Now they cited the provisions of law section 54 saying that there is a provision which says that if I have wrongly paid tax, then the tax that I had wrongly paid is to be refunded, provided there is no adjustment against any demand which is outstanding. If there is any demand outstanding, then that refund has to be adjusted against that demand and only the net balance has to be paid. Relying on that provision, the High Court said that it clearly means that if there is an IGST liability, it is the tax which is outstanding. So instead of giving refund of SGST, they should have adjusted it against IGST, and hence there is no need to pay IGST again. Now, I have my doubts on this ruling, but what are your thoughts? Where for someone is wrongly determined place of supply and hence discharge IGST instead of, let us say, C and S, then according to you, what should as an auditor do? Whether we should ask again for the payment of correct tax and apply for the refund, or rely on this ruling or any other interpretation that you might have where some kind of adjustment is possible and hence we need not pay and seek refund.
Now this question is quite interesting and very important for all of us to get. Can we take a clue of this High Court judgment which is coming in that SGST credit can be adjusted for IGST payment or vice versa, whatever it might be. If we look at section 77 of CGST Act 2017 when we are referring to, and I've discussed that you have treated some transactions as intrastate, then you must have charged CGST and SGST, but later on that turned out to be interstate, IGST should have been charged. So what happened? Law specifically says that you pay IGST and whatever CGST, SGST have collected and deposited, go for refund of CGST and SGST. But look at from taxpayer perspective. For him, this credit is nothing but a money. Only it is segregated into particular compartment of CGST central, SGST for state, and IGST combination of both together, central and state, till the time appropriated for the state. Now, having said that, we have seen even in e-cash ledger, which we are maintaining with the e-credit ledger, we have to segregate, we have to allocate the money in respective ledger account of CGST, SGST, IGST, UTGST, compensation cess. Now, this is the irony of GST law because we are in a dual concurrent GST model. The SGST component, if it is allowed to be adjusted to the central, which is not permissible, CGST credit cannot be utilized for SGST or vice versa. IGST is only interim account till the time it is being appropriated between central and state. Now, looking at Section 54, for this judgment has come in. This is only providing ease of business for the taxpayer. This is not giving a law position perspective so open that you can adjust CGST with SGST, then it will go for HNY. To my mind, it will go for HNY. So what best can be done and what is the best way forward in this regard? Of course, this is a good point made by a taxpayer. If I pay the taxes, of course, I made the mistake making an SGST, should have been adjusted with IGST. Government should have some internal mechanism through which they can adjust, readjust these kind of allocation. And when they are working on e-mode, they are talking about they are working on e-platform. Why can't they open up such kind of one-time adjustment or two-time adjustment or three-time adjustment for such kind of transaction instead of depositing IGST and go for refund of CGST and SGST, and for which time period is also not guaranteed. How long they will take to refund the money? To my mind, law-wise, if you go strictly, then this looks like not possible. But if you go from ease of business perspective, of course, government can amend anything for the facilitation, for a taxpayer-friendly measure, which helps India as a whole and making GST the seamless flow of credit and utilization pan till the time it is not hurting the basic concept of GST.
So with that, sir, thank you so much, and thank you viewers for viewing this video. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you.